And now I'm going to introduce Susana, who's going to take the next presentation away. She is going to be presenting on Carl Jung's 8 cognitive styles and the ways in which those cognitive styles can show up in both oppressing and liberating activities. Her title is Neurodiversity and Social Action, Exploring Oppression and Liberation Through the Jungian Cognitive Functions. As we all work towards anti-racism and liberation, how we do so can look really different. And that could just be on the basis of our cognitive processes. So Susana is going to do a beautiful presentation on her beautiful work associated with exploring those different manifestations of both oppressive and liberating activities based on cognitive process. Thank you, Susana. Pass it to you.
Good afternoon. I would like to begin by offering special thanks to my dear friend Corinna, who is in the audience and who empowered me to make this presentation today. Colonialism expects us all to be the same. That psychologist Carl Jung posed a way for us to look at this and how we process and filter information, make decisions, and organize ourselves. Recently, there has been further research on this dimension of what we might call neurodiversity, comprising in-depth observation, interviews, and EEG brain mapping. Today, I will be discussing 8 cognitive processes and how each can contribute to both oppression and liberation. Why is this relevant to us as scholar, practitioner, activists? Along with studying Jung's work over the last decade, I have been part of liberatory action and dialogue across various settings. In academic settings, I often notice people writing colleagues off as disinterested in liberatory work, when the case may be that one person's way of engaging with issues of liberation happens not to match the other person's notion of what that should look like. Besides generating resentment that ultimately impacts people facing oppression, this dynamic brings up many themes relevant to liberatory work. These include in-group, out-group dynamics, majority bias, minority stress, our need to honor individual difference, our need for introspection, and our need to dismantle hegemonies over reality, along with unexamined projections onto others. Take a look at what research estimates to be the percentage of the US population that primarily uses each cognitive process. This begins to tell us about the potential for people to fall into majority bias or experience minority stress along these lines. Some things to keep in mind as we move forward. First, we each use all the cognitive processes and need all of them. Even so, we tend to have those we prefer and that we use with more familiarity and awareness. Second, I will be referring to introverted and extroverted processes. This simply refers to whether the process attends to the inner world or the outer world. Third, according to Jung's theory, under stress, we may begin to lean disproportionately on our most preferred cognitive process or fall into the grip of ones we usually do not value. In either case, we find ourselves using the process defensively rather than tapping into its full potential. As people working with generations of trauma, it can be helpful for each of us to note what happens when we are under stress. Fourth, and most importantly, it is when we devalue a cognitive process that we are likely to use it in detrimental ways or project it onto other people and groups. As you listen, I invite you to consider your own relationship to each cognitive process. Can you identify the cognitive processes toward which you are more inclined and the ones you value less? Consider your preferred theories and clinical priorities. I also invite you to notice your visceral responses as I cover each cognitive process. In addition, see if you can identify the ways in which stereotypes consist of cognitive processes projected onto other people and groups. I will transition now into talking about each cognitive process. I often see people associating a liberatory mindset with extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling involves attuning to feelings, ideals, and values stemming from outside ourselves. Engaged in this process, we would likely prioritize maintaining harmony with our environment, living as part of something larger, decentering from our needs to attend to the needs of others. We would respond to value-laden language, social feedback, the notion of social responsibility, as well as communication that evokes emotion in us. Think of how a gathering or a ceremony has the ability to help people grieve, celebrate, or unite in protest. Overvalued or used defensively, extroverted feeling can look like attempting to use others as objects for the purpose of maintaining perceived group harmony, groupthink, conformity, being afraid to rock the boat, excluding people perceived to disrupt harmony. Consider someone being stereotyped as, quote unquote, an angry Black woman when she attempts to use her voice. Or think of the times when you or someone else might have been afraid to say the quote unquote wrong thing at the expense of a rich dialogue. We could also look to colleagues with a good grasp on extroverted feeling for their ability to pick up on others' needs, foster a sense of inclusion and belonging, communicate in a way that speaks to the other's concerns and needs, and to communicate from a place of communion. Each cognitive process falls on an axis. On the other end of the axis from extroverted feeling, we have introverted thinking. If someone or a group finds themselves stuck in extroverted feeling, introverted thinking can help to balance it out, and vice versa. Introverted thinking is an energy-intensive process that works toward developing a coherent internal framework of understanding based on logical consistency. Introverted thinking is at work when we pick apart the flawed logic and supremacist beliefs. It is at work when we refuse to settle on being politically correct or throwing buzzwords around in favor of developing a thorough understanding of the issue at hand. Overvalued or used defensively, introverted thinking can look like overconfidence in one's categorical, theoretical, or binary thinking, attempting to use people as objects to maintain one's sense of logical consistency. Think of those situations when a white person sees a person of color and asks, "What are you?" Or think of textbooks on diversity where particular traits are attributed to particular racial and ethnic groups, contributing to stereotyping. However, we could also look to our colleagues with a good grasp on introverted thinking to help apply independent, rigorous, and critical thinking to our endeavors and provide concepts to make sense of our experience. Critical race theory, borderlands theory, critical pedagogy, psychoanalytic theories, all of these required introverted thinking to take shape. Now I'll move on to a different axis. Extroverted thinking is a cognitive process that concerns itself with impacting the external environment with one's logic. In our society, if we were engaged in extroverted thinking, we would be focused on planning, strategizing, and execution, and on being pragmatic, utilitarian, and outcome-focused. We would prioritize action over details, unswayed by emotional appeals, and using the least amount of energy possible to achieve our intended results. We would rely only on measurable sensory information. When extroverted thinking is overvalued or used defensively, it can look like using others as objects in the service of one's goals, personal or systemic rigidity, maintaining a top-down process. We might implement policy that leaves people or the nuances of their experience slipping through the cracks. It may be important to consider that a great deal of trauma in our society has resulted from the dominant culture's overvaluing of this process. Think of the colonial laws resulting in slavery, genocide, and the desecration of sacred lands in the name of quote-unquote development. Think of the erasure of people's histories from public education. Picture corporate America. Consider also the approach to assignments that we internalize in school. Focus and get it done. Precisely because of the trauma associated with this process, we need our colleagues well-versed in extroverted thinking to help implement reparative procedures, standards, and protocols conceived through collaboration. Examples include instituting anti-discriminatory laws, modifying training standards within a profession to be more in line with equity, rezoning a city to address segregation, or suing for workers' rights, tenants' rights, or women's rights. Introverted feeling forms an axis with extroverted thinking. Introverted feeling is associated with attunement to our own feelings, ideals, and values, and to seeking harmony within ourselves. Introverted feeling is at work when we say to ourselves or others, listen to your heart, or just be. It is at work when we talk about personal identity and individuality, and when we listen deeply to someone else, then evaluate what we have heard based on our own rich inner world of feelings, our personal values, or our conscience. When introverted feeling is overvalued or used defensively, it can look like attempting to use others as objects to achieve inner harmony. We might close off to perspectives not expressed in ways consonant with our sense of identity. We may be engaged in introverted feeling when we think to ourselves, I can't imagine ever having a part in oppression. I am a good person. We may also participate in social justice efforts, largely to assuage our guilt, which objectifies the people that oppression most impacts. Meanwhile, we can also cherish the way in which introverted feeling inclines our colleagues toward liberatory work, recognizing that the current state of affairs violates their desires, values, and conscience. Being attuned to our individualities can also allow us to honor other people's complexities. This is especially important in light of research showing that people of non-marginalized groups disturbingly tend to think of marginalized individuals as less similar to themselves. Now we come to extroverted sensing. If we were engaged in extroverted sensing, we would be focused on integrating bodily and sensory information and responding to the physical environment in the here and now. Facing injustice, we might respond with direct action, picket lines, sit-ins, calls to action. In a group, we might hear, let's get our hands dirty, or why are we sitting around here talking and not doing something? Valued or used defensively, extroverted sensing can look like using others to maintain physical stimulation or action over introspection, making others the objects of this process. We see this when a police officer shoots an unarmed person. Extroverted thinking is likely also involved when a psychotherapy clinic assigns every patient of color to a therapist of the same presumed race, making the assumption that the same color of skin equals a good fit, or when outsiders search to communities they perceive as needing quote-unquote help, without considering the community's self-determination. Even so, extroverted sensing underlies our attention and quick embodied responsiveness to the very tangible forms that oppression takes. For instance, it takes extroverted sensing for us to notice that toxic waste facilities are often built in working class communities. Extroverted sensing is also the process by which we notice the beauty of our beloved places. On the other side of the axis from extroverted sensing is introverted intuition. If we were engaged in introverted intuition as a cognitive process, we would be harnessing our entire brains rather than confining ourselves to established pathways. Insights might come to us in aha moments or even in dreams, and we might express them in the form of an abstraction, a symbol, an image, or a metaphor. Introverted intuition lends itself to visual thinking. Introverted intuition is active when we look beneath the surface at what might be unconscious or intangible. It is active when we view things as multi-layered, paradoxical, and connected to central, perhaps universal themes. When introverted intuition is overvalued or used defensively, it can look like using others as objects to validate one's hunches or further one's ideals. Hitler united many around his ideal, leading into physical form without support. Critical use of introverted intuition looks very different. Oppression relies on the mass acceptance of a malignant normality. Introverted intuition shakes this up, being a process that looks beneath the surface of consensual reality and cultural norms. Someone using introverted intuition also has the potential to powerfully unite people around a transformative vision. Whereas introverted intuition transcends the familiar, introverted sensing focuses on what is tried and true. Engaged in an introverted sensing process, we might think of dismantling oppression in terms of following best practices, following established protocols and routines, doing what we know is good for our bodies, learning from past mistakes, minding social feedback, moving toward a tangible outcome in a linear fashion, monitoring the process stepwise. When introverted sensing is overvalued or used defensively, it can look like using other people to maintain a sense of familiarity and security. Introverted sensing is involved when we dismiss knowledge and ideas from anyone except the people who our culture imbues with expertise. Introverted sensing is likely also at the forefront when we hear people say, "Let's not set a precedent," or "let's not make ourselves physically uncomfortable," even if it is becoming clear that the status quo is harming people. Introverted sensing otherwise contributes greatly to the work of liberation. The dominant narrative about liberation speaks of it as moving forward. However, we might also consider that liberation involves. On the other side of the axis, balancing out introverted sensing is extroverted intuition. When someone uses this process, different parts of the brain light up alternately in the pattern of Christmas tree lights. This is trans-contextual thinking. Extroverted intuition is active when we ask what if, talk about what could be, come up with fast creative responses, or combine seemingly unrelated concepts. Why can't a group of women together be our president? Why can't we grow vegetable gardens on the roofs of skyscrapers? If these ideas sound wild, remember that the latter is already being done. When extroverted intuition is overvalued or used defensively, it can look like using other people as objects to maintain one's sense of novelty. For instance, many people jump on board with racial justice initiatives when a public case of police brutality occurs against a Black person. Extroverted intuition may be involved when someone drops out once the work begins to seem routine. Extroverted intuition otherwise plays a very important role in the work of liberation. Say you are a person on the receiving end of prejudice who has internalized the message that you won't have much of a future. Being in the presence of someone inclined toward possibility and potential can be a healing experience, given that trauma forecloses the imagination and colonization has left us with immeasurable amounts of trauma to contend with across generations. We need the imagination of our colleagues who tend to use extroverted intuition. Now that you have heard about each of the cognitive processes, I invite you to reflect on your community's or organization's relationship to each cognitive process. Are there angles to add to how you have been viewing liberation? How might you empower colleagues inclined toward each cognitive process? How might others empower your contributions? Then imagine what it would be like if your community could be integrating an awareness of all the cognitive processes into the work of liberation. Thank you.